The desert night was heavy with silence, broken only by the hiss of torches as priests carried their flames into the sanctum. In 1290 BCE, within the towering stone walls of Karnak Temple, a ritual began that even ancient scribes described with trembling ink. To the outside world, Egypt was a land of gods, wisdom, and monuments. But in the shadows of its sanctuaries, a darker practice unfolded, the most horrific sexual practice of ancient Egypt, where human bodies became offerings and desire was fused with devotion. The priests claimed that fertility was the heartbeat of the Nile. Every year, the river's floodwaters brought life to Egypt, and so they believed they must mirror that cycle with their own bodies. Did you know that Egyptian temples preserved accounts of ritualized public sexuality, meant to awaken the gods? These ceremonies, cloaked in religious duty, turned individuals into vessels, stripping away identity and leaving them as instruments of divine will. Inside Karnak's hypostyle hall, the ceiling soared like a stone sky, but all eyes were fixed on a chosen maiden, dressed in linen so sheer it revealed more than it concealed. She was not here by choice. Her family, bound to temple service, had surrendered her. The high priest, painted with ochre and scented with oils, began the chants. The air thickened with incense. The maiden's tears ran silently, unacknowledged, as her body was offered in symbolic union with Amun-Ra, the sun god. For the crowd, this was sacred. For her, it was humiliation written into her very flesh. These were not isolated acts. In Thebes, inscriptions describe pharaohs themselves participating in rites to renew the cosmos. Pharaoh Ramses II, records suggest, enacted fertility dramas before statues of the gods, with priests and courtiers compelled to witness. Imagine the weight of spectacle, a ruler's body staged not as sovereign, but as symbolic seed, planting cosmic order before thousands. The boundaries between power, sex, and piety blurred until no line remained, and the cruelty deepened. Victims were often chosen from slaves, captives of war, or the poor who could not refuse the temple's summons. For them, refusal was death. Egypt's conquest of Nubia, for instance, supplied countless women who were paraded into rituals they could not even understand, their tongues foreign to Egyptian chants, their dignity crushed beneath the weight of ceremony. One account, preserved on papyrus, chillingly refers to them as fertile soil for the gods. Soil, not souls. Did you know that ancient Egyptian law provided no protection for temple servants? Once bound, they belonged to the gods, meaning to the priests who served as intermediaries. A crying wife might watch her husband marked and surrendered to temple duty, or a father might lose his daughter to the priesthood without recourse. The loss was total: body, name, future. The Nile's rhythm demanded repetition. Every season, as the floodwaters receded, the rites returned. The chants, the sacrifices, the humiliations. In Memphis, priests of Ptah staged processions where virgins were paraded before altars and stripped bare, their vulnerability transformed into supposed symbols of renewal. And yet, beneath the roar of drums, one could hear the muffled sobs of those who understood their role was not sacred, but exploited. The practice bled into festivals. During the Opet festival in Thebes, when statues of Amun were carried from Karnak to Luxor, drunken revelry masked darker undertones. Sexual license was encouraged, even demanded, as a way to honour the gods. Crowds mingled in chaotic passion, but within private chambers, selected victims bore the brunt of orchestrated ritual acts. For the elite, it was divine celebration. For the powerless, it was degradation cloaked as duty. One Egyptian text, written in the reign of Seti I, describes the pharaoh's symbolic act of impregnating the land. Scholars today interpret this as metaphor, but fragments suggest that the performance was not purely symbolic. It involved real bodies, real violations, enacted before the watching eyes of the court. The gods demanded submission, and so submission was delivered. A soldier, returning from campaign, might mark prisoners with ochre, branding them for temple use. Some were led into workshops to carve stone, others into sanctuaries to serve as sexual vessels. The cruelty was systemic, an unspoken economy of bodies traded for blessings. A noblewoman, stripped of her family name after her husband's disgrace, might be confined to temple service as a concubine of the gods, her identity erased, her humiliation eternal. Did you know that the festival of drunkenness, dedicated to Hathor, goddess of love and destruction, often spiraled into orgiastic rites that archaeologists still struggle to interpret? Wine flowed like blood, inhibitions collapsed, and sacred spaces turned into theatres of excess. Reliefs show men and women intertwined under the watchful eyes of priests, who recorded the chaos as divine ecstasy. Yet behind the veneer of celebration lurked coercion, with many driven to participate unwillingly, bound by fear of punishment. The imagery carved on temple walls reveals only fragments, hints of breasts, figures bent in poses of submission, gods towering above. What those walls do not show is the trembling of captives, the silent prayers of those wishing the stone would collapse and bury them before the ritual began. For while Egypt's monuments have endured millennia, the cries of its victims have long since been swallowed by the sand. And so the paradox emerges. A civilization admired for wisdom, medicine, and architecture also practiced some of the most horrific rites known to antiquity. In Egypt, the sacred and the profane intertwined, leaving a trail of human suffering carved invisibly beneath its golden legacy. The Nile glittered under the noon sun as barges drifted south, their decks crowded with prisoners taken in Pharaoh's wars. Bound at the wrists, stripped of ornaments, their eyes scanned the unfamiliar horizon. They were Nubians, Libyans, Syrians, men and women torn from their homes and now carried into the belly of Egypt. What awaited them was not only forced labour in quarries or fields, but a far more insidious fate, sexual captivity disguised as servitude. Egypt's grandeur was built on conquest, and conquest brought slaves. Did you know that at the height of the New Kingdom, Egypt counted tens of thousands of foreign captives? Some were absorbed into households as servants, others were sent to temples, and a select few, the young, the beautiful, the pliable, were funneled into the hidden economy of sexual exploitation. The palaces of Thebes and Memphis were not only centres of power, they were also arenas of desire and dominance. Within their walls existed harems, guarded compounds filled with women drawn from across the empire. To the outside, they were described as houses of beauty, dedicated to the pleasures of Pharaoh. Inside, they were prisons where women lived and died at the whims of men who saw them as possessions. A noblewoman from Mitanni, once a princess in her homeland, could find herself locked among concubines, her name erased, her title reduced to nothing more than the king's woman. The silenced voices multiply. A crying wife in Canaan may have watched her husband slaughtered, her children enslaved, and then found herself marched naked into Egypt's markets. There, traders assessed her body as if it were livestock, prodding, bargaining, bartering, not for labour, but for her youth and fertility. She would be led away not to a field, but to a bed she did not choose. The records call it service. Temple scrolls list these women as offerings, their lives reduced to ink on papyrus. One fragment, preserved in the Turin erotic papyrus, depicts scenes so explicit that scholars still debate whether they represent satire or reality. Yet alongside the drawings, administrative notes confirm the existence of women catalogued for sacred pleasure. What was drawn with laughter may have masked a dark truth lived in silence, and it was not only women, boys too were taken into this system. Did you know that young male captives were sometimes castrated to serve as eunuchs within royal households and temples? For them, the loss was both physical and spiritual. Stripped of manhood, they became instruments of control, guarding harems they could never touch, watching others endure what they themselves had narrowly escaped. Their hollow gazes filled palace corridors, unacknowledged but ever present. The harem itself was a place of contradictions. Gilded walls, scented gardens, and silk cushions painted a picture of luxury. But behind the finery lay despair. Jealous rivalries turned women against one another, fighting for the scraps of Pharaoh's attention. Failure meant obscurity. Success meant bearing a child who might one day become a pawn in palace intrigue. In 1155 BCE, during the so-called harem conspiracy, wives and concubines of Ramses III plotted his assassination, not out of love but out of desperation, each seeking survival in a world where their bodies were bargaining chips. Imagine the scene. A foreign girl, barely 15, taken from her family in a raid, now forced to dance before men she despised. her eyes shimmer with tears as drums beat, drowning her sobs, or the soldier marking captives with red pigment, branding them for use in the palace. Each stroke of colour stripped another layer of dignity, reducing flesh to property. Egyptian society rarely recorded the pain of these victims. Official inscriptions glorified Pharaoh's power, never the screams of those it crushed, yet hints survive in private letters. One ostracon from Deir el-Medina speaks of women hidden away, weeping for their homes. Another laments a daughter taken to serve in the great house, her name unspoken, her fate understood. Slavery and sexual exploitation were inseparable. The line between sacred ritual and forced servitude blurred until they became the same system. The gods demanded fertility. Pharaoh demanded heirs, soldiers demanded spoils, and it was always the vulnerable who paid the price. Did you know that even in death these victims were denied peace? While noble Egyptians were embalmed, adorned, and buried with care, slaves and concubines often had no tombs, their bodies discarded without rites. Their voices were silenced not only in life, but in eternity, and yet, across millennia, the echoes remain. Archaeologists unearthing skeletons in workmen's villages sometimes find signs of malnutrition and abuse, bones fractured by repeated strain. In one burial pit near Amarna, young women's remains show evidence of violent treatment, haunting physical testimony of the human cost behind Egypt's grandeur. The reflection is unavoidable. A civilization celebrated for its pyramids, art, and medicine also carried within it a shadow world of exploitation. Behind the golden mask of Tutankhamun, behind the soaring obelisks and serene temples, lived thousands whose bodies were currency, whose suffering was sanctified by power. The story ends not with comfort, but with a reckoning. Across history, empires have risen on the backs of the exploited, dressing brutality in the robes of ritual or the language of divinity. Ancient Egypt was no different, and the haunting truth is this: when power sanctifies cruelty, the cries of the silence never vanish. They linger, buried beneath stone, whispering through time, a reminder that the brightest civilizations often cast the darkest shadows.